Welcome to this introduction to the project Psalms Layer by Layer, which is being run by the nonprofit Cambridge Digital Bible Research in collaboration with many other missions organizations, in particular SIL and UBS. I'm Elizabeth Robar, and I'll be leading you through some highlights of our project so far. The backstory is that Katie Frost, formerly Hogerheide, worked with SIL as an ethno-arts consultant, and she repeatedly saw translators struggling significantly with translating the Psalms. Testimony from across the world revealed a strong connection between churches who were able to pray and sing the Psalms together, and those with a strong sense of communal faith. But translations of Psalms that were not attuned to the poetry, either of the Hebrew or of the receptor language, went largely unused. Not only did communities need the Psalms, they needed a translation rich in poetry. Katie imagined developing a resource that would target those challenges. It was hers to dream and lay the groundwork for when God also brought me onto the scene. You will be aware of how the Bible translation world simultaneously abounds in excellent resources, and yet translators struggle because using existing resources feels like digging for buried treasure on a deadline, as our end-user report found. You know that scholars see riches in the biblical text, but technical analysis is often divorced from theology. This is at its worst in poetry, where translators feel the tension between being faithful to the meaning of the words or being faithful to the overall effect of the poetry. How can they be faithful to God's word in its entirety? We are part of a new generation of tools that answers this need. Let's start with Psalm 1. Blessed is the one who does not walk in step with the wicked, or stand in the way that sinners take, or sit in the company of mockers, but whose delight is in the law of the Lord, and who meditates on his law day and night. That person is like a tree planted by streams of water, which yields its fruit in season and whose leaf does not wither. Whatever they do prospers. Not so the wicked. They are like chaff that the wind blows away. Therefore, the wicked will not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the assembly of the righteous. For the Lord watches over the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked leads to destruction. This psalm is beloved, partly for its complexity. We're going to start with just the first two words in Hebrew, whose English translations in 7 different versions are shown here. To study this text, either for the sake of our personal devotions or for the sake of Bible translation, we might begin by looking at the differences between the various English translations. Here we have 3 colors pertaining to 3 different categories to which these questions belong. The red oval has to do with the meaning of blessed or happy or joys, the semantics of that Hebrew word. The blue oval is the thorny question of whether we have a man, who's truly a single male, or whether this should be a plural or gender neutral, because that more accurately represents the meaning. That refers to both the grammar and the question of participants. The green oval is a little less obvious, but it refers to the sentence structure or the syntax, precisely that difference between happy is the man and how happy is the man, or even oh, the joys of. These are the first 3 issues translators would know to raise simply from looking at these English translations. These are the kinds of questions translators need to ask about any text, so materials prepared for translators should cover these. Here you see, in summary, our own model of our work, and where we situate the proper place for these. As with anything a person might want to understand, we split our materials into the analysis, pulling everything apart, like scholars or scientists at a dissecting table, the synthesis, putting it back together to make sense of it, and the application, doing something with it. Right now, the translator is asking questions that belong in the analysis layer, which we have resting on several pillars. The questions so far rely on an analysis of the grammar, participants, semantics, and syntax of the text. Our first question had to do with happy, blessed, or joys, which refers to the semantics, so we'll begin there. The notorious difficulty in translating a word or phrase is all the associations a given culture has, which another culture may not have. The first step for us in our semantic analysis is to disentangle associations from our own culture, as we're building this prototype, and the Hebrew culture. This has been such a valuable process that, for cultures with a significantly different worldview from the Hebrew worldview, we will equip translators to do this as well for their own sake. But, working simply within a modern Western culture, we have the first word of Psalm 1:1, which in Hebrew is ashrei, the construct of ashrim. It's actually a noun, more or less meaning blessedness. If you look at the center of our Venn diagram, you see that our culture and Hebrew share the idea of held in reverence or honored. For Westerners, we tend to think of blessedness as confined to religion, or perhaps personal happiness, or even emotion. It is important to recognize that those are not associations shared by the Hebrew. By contrast, in Hebrew, the word refers to somebody who is considered by others to be fortunate and blessed. It conveys a sense of admiration for someone. How do we know this? One of the excellent resources available is the Semantic Dictionary of Biblical Hebrew, edited by Rainier de Blois. Its claim to fame is the reconstruction of the cognitive model of the world represented by the biblical text. As much as scholarship enables us, getting into the heads of the ancient Hebrews and how they thought of these words. As you can see here in the SDBH entry, this word is understood within the category of praise, and it actually refers more to what others think of somebody than to somebody's own personal emotion. It conveys the admiration of the onlookers. This is vital information. The words emotional exegesis are at the top of the screen because one of the most overlooked needs of translators is understanding the emotions at play in a given text. Deaf translators, and oral Bible translators in particular, have been sending out pleas for emotional exegesis because they are required to include emotions, and if nobody helps them out, it becomes pure guesswork. Just recently, 2 sign language translators presented to our team, stating baldly how much they have to guess and how much they would benefit from a resource that laid out the emotions. This means that by making explicit that this word indicates an attitude of admiration on the part of the speaker, we are equipping deaf translators and oral Bible translators with vital information for how they should perform the text. Instead of guessing, they can have confidence that they are reflecting the text faithfully. And for ourselves, this person is somebody the text is asking us to admire. I just said this person because I was avoiding the question of whether this is a man or a generic person, but that's not good enough for translators. We'll start with the grammar. Grammatically, there's no doubt that the word ish is masculine and singular, and the associated verbs are also masculine and singular, since Hebrew verbs always indicate both the gender and number of their subjects. But, as we know, grammatical gender and physical sex need not coincide. I grew up with an English teacher for a mother, so I knew well that if I heard, "If anybody wants dessert, he must finish his dinner," and I knew that that was the generic he, which applied equally to my brothers and to me, the only girl. We return here to SDBH, and we immediately find that this word ish in Hebrew is a member of a community or group consisting either of men or women, or of men only. The word itself does not lay stress on the sex of the person. This means we have no justification from the word itself to assume a male, but nor do we have justification to assume that maleness is not in view. We need more information from a different section of analysis. We therefore move to the question of participants, or the question of just who is who in this psalm. Some have argued that, in the words of one scholar, the righteous individual of Psalm 1 is given a distinctly royal profile. Let's look at some of the arguments for this view, at the same time demonstrating one method we have for organizing existing scholarship into a form that translators can easily follow. This is an example of material useful to translators that, frankly, most would never likely take the time to pursue. If, however, we can provide the relevant material at the relevant time, they can benefit. First, there's an argument from the tree imagery of verse 3, where he is like a tree planted by streams of water. In both the biblical and ancient Near Eastern tradition, the individual most typically identified with a tree is a person of royalty. For example, a Sumerian king, Shulgi, is said to be a date palm planted by a water ditch. The water ditch there would be the same as the irrigation canal or the palgei mayim, the streams of water that we have here in Psalm 1. The Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar has a dream in which he's a massive tree that provides shelter and food to all kinds of creatures. And then there's King David, who refers to himself in Psalm 52:10 as a flourishing olive tree. It's important to realize that these are not coincidences. These images are distinctively royal in nature, intended to convey the royal character of these men. Another argument made in support of a royal profile for the individual of Psalm 1 is from a parallel passage, Deuteronomy 17. What the man does in Psalm 1, meditate on the law, is exactly what the king is told to do in Deuteronomy 17. Now, not everybody would have the time or ability to meditate on the law. This was not a leisure activity. This was a requirement for the one who needed it in order to guide the people. The command for the king in Deuteronomy 17 says that the king must not do three things: amass horses, amass wives, and amass money. Instead, he's to do one thing: copy the law and read it all the days of his life. Solomon is most commonly linked with this passage because, sadly, he did do exactly those three things. Yet he was also a paradigmatic king. It was copying the law that was supposed to distinctively mark the king, which is a reminder that any one portion of the psalm may provide hints, but the entirety of the psalm should corroborate any conclusions made. Here we see indications of multiple points of evidence, all pointing to a royal connection with the Ish introduced here. Finally, some argue for a royal profile of the man in Psalm 1 based on the parallels between Psalm 1 and Psalm 2. The lexical and thematic correspondences between Psalm 1 and Psalm 2 show a parallel between the man of Psalm 1 and the anointed of Psalm 2. Psalm 1 begins with Ashrei, blessed, and Psalm 2 ends with Ashrei, blessed. This is a common means of packaging a single unit in Hebrew, which is an invitation to explore further connections. In Psalm 1 we have the man, or the one, the Lord, the wicked, and the righteous. In Psalm 2 we have the nations, those who take refuge, the Lord, and the anointed king. The anointed of Psalm 2 proclaims the decree, just as the man of Psalm 1 thinks on the law of the Lord. The king of Psalm 2 is installed on Mount Zion. The man of Psalm 1 is planted on, using the same preposition in Hebrew, streams of water. Both figures are in a unique relationship with the Lord and granted success. When we consider these connections between the man of Psalm 1 and the king of Psalm 2, along with the echoes of Deuteronomy 17 and the royal overtones of the tree imagery, we can see why it is said that the righteous individual of Psalm 1 is given a distinctly royal profile. Now, the purpose for that royal profile we will leave for a different layer. What we must recognize here is that the identity of this participant includes, by its context, a royal profile. That does not mean the word itself is royal. There's nothing royal about the word ish. But it's the participant, the one to whom this word refers, who does seem to have royal connotations. One more question our translation team raised, and that was the question of syntax. Is it happy is, or how happy is, or what? This is the question of sentence structure, which fits within syntax. Here we have a grammatical diagram again, which is useful because it uses a few lines and physical position to tell us an awful lot about the Hebrew grammar. Those teal stair steps you see are all the same grammatical phenomenon, the construct chain. It means two words are pronounced together, and in English we put the word of in between. So happiness and the man becomes the happiness of the man. In Hebrew grammar, there isn't even a sentence here. It's just, quite simply, the happiness of the man. But that does not mean that we should translate it into other languages with an analogous structure. Instead, we have to understand the function of this construct chain in Hebrew. If we were to translate it as happy is the man, then we end up translating the function of an assertion, here, an assertion of happiness, as in wisdom sayings. If we were to translate it as the happiness of the man, then we haven't actually started a full sentence. We've just introduced a topic as if it were the function of a commentary, and we're going to comment on this topic of the happiness of the man. If we translate it as, oh, the happiness of the man, then we're considering this as an exclamation, and in this case, an exclamation of admiration. It is not our specific translation that matters, but rather the function indicated by the sentence structure. The same sentence structure will have different functions at different times, which is what enables scholars to have a job. Here, however, what we just covered in semantics, that the word ashrei conveys an attitude of admiration, is of immense benefit and helps us to decide. It is the speaker's attitude that is in view, not the person's own future or happiness. This is an exclamation conveying the speaker's own admiration. If we were to stop here, we'd already gain much. Psalm 1 provides a portrait that we're to admire. That's valuable. But it is far from everything within the text. It does not dig it all into the poetry of the text, and it has become a truism that in poetry the form is as much a part of the message as the words. The translators who do not know Hebrew are cut off from much of the message they've been tasked with translating. Indeed, not only the poetics, but also the imagery, the discourse, and the canonical context. All of these contain valuable parts of the overall message of a psalm. Yet many translators don't even know what questions to ask in order to benefit from them. We'll sample some of the poetics. One staple of Hebrew poetry is sound repetition. You can see here that in happy is the one or the man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked. In the Hebrew it is ashrei ha'ish asher lo halach b'atzat resha'im. The ashrei, happy, asher, who, and resha'im, with the root rashach, all share the same three sounds. This is an absolute staple of Hebrew, which, whereas English likes to have rhyme, Hebrew likes to repeat sounds, not necessarily in the same order. And in fact, here you can see that they're mixed up. Now, if we look carefully at this slide, you can see that not only are the sounds in a different order, but there's something peculiar about the different order. What is this sound play actually doing? Here, that you can see that the sounds have been completely inverted from ashrei to reshach. They're the opposite of each other, which is a slight poetic hint that the happy one, the ashrei, is the opposite of the wicked one, the reshach. Now, this is just a hint in poetry, but remember, the richness of poetry is from all the subtleties, and it's the abundance of subtleties that build up the value of poetry. And so we need to catalog all these subtleties so that in the end, those that are confirmed by many other elements of the poetry from different layers, those are the ones that we'll pay attention to, but we can only know that by first accumulating a list of subtle poetic features like this. Now, another bread and butter technique in Hebrew poetry is wordplay. In this case, you can see that the word ashrei sounds like another Hebrew word, which is ashure. The word ashure means footsteps. And so, the happiness of the man who does not walk, ashrei ha'ish asher lo halach, sounds a lot like the footsteps of the man who does not walk, ashure ha'ish asher lo halach. The image of walking makes this sound association with footsteps even more likely. Looking at this next slide, you'll notice that the relative particle asher, translated who or which, occurs all throughout this psalm. This is peculiar because the relative particle is actually known for not appearing in Hebrew poetry. It's very rare. We find it all the time in our prose, in our narrative, but we find it rarely in poetry. And so the question is, why does it occur so much here? If you see that there's a sound play, a word play in this case, between the ashrei and the asher echoing the sound of footsteps, you see that there's actually a resonance throughout the psalm of the idea of footsteps walking along a journey. The poetic effect of having this wordplay echoing throughout the psalm is that the idea of footsteps, the idea of progressing along a path, along a journey, is kept very much front and center in the reader's or hearer's mind as you go throughout the psalm. We've now walked through the elements of analysis that are particularly relevant to this portion of Psalm 1:1. After the analysis, the pulling everything apart, comes the synthesis, the putting everything back together. This is a process in and of itself. The synthesis will be carried out at the level of the whole psalm. Building on the analysis, it will show the main point of the psalm, the main structural divisions of the psalm, and highlight any points of prominence. Because we have not yet completed the full analysis of Psalm 1, we don't yet have a synthesis of the whole psalm. For now, in anticipation of the synthesis, we can at least summarize our analysis up to this point. This we've termed the analytical summary, the first step in preparing a synthesis. Psalm 1:1a, just the first bit of the first verse, is best understood as an exclamation of admiration for the one with a royal profile who chooses the opposite path of the wicked. These are the key elements. There's admiration at stake. This is not a dispassionate account or commentary. The speaker is openly expressing admiration, and that needs to come across in translations, and especially performed translations. This one is a complex figure that has strong overtones of a royal figure that tie in closely with Psalm 2, but is also the ideal person that we're all called to emulate. Those multiple references need somehow to be kept in view. And this one is admired because in some way he's the opposite of the wicked. Just with that sound play, we have an initial signal of how incompatible the admired one is compared to the wicked. You have to choose between being admired and being wicked. There's no making the two of them work together. Note that this is included in the summary of the analysis, prompted by the sound play, but ultimately because it is confirmed by our analysis of the rest of the psalm. We only include in the synthetic layer those elements with sufficient evidence to merit confidence. And finally, the wordplay having to do with footsteps picks up on the path and journey imagery throughout the psalm. It's just an initial hint, but it signals the dominant metaphor that helps structure the entire psalm. If the translator recognizes that signal from the very first word, the psalm can start off on the right foot. Because we're only presenting a fraction of a verse here, we do not have a proper synthesis, because that is at the psalm level. We can give a foretaste, however, for what happens at the application level. Of course, the majority of application is done by the translators and other artists, producing renditions of the text in their particular contexts. We're hoping to build a library of such works at the application layer. We will work closely with translators and artists for the sake of quality assurance. helping them evaluate how well their own work ends up with the same message as the original Hebrew. When we're working alongside people, this can be part of the checking process. The evaluation will derive directly from our synthesis, and in this case, from our summary analysis. Our key issues included the element of admiration. Which translations capture that? In English, blessed starts up a beatitude, which is a bit formal for colloquial English, but it does convey admiration. The plural those is gender neutral, which clearly and accurately suggests that this psalm is applicable to anyone, but it leaves no room for royal overtones or any hint of a special role for the one. The word man is more conducive to a royal interpretation, since, in Israel, the royal profile was prototypically masculine. Still, the English word man is more restrictive than the Hebrew word ish, and it may suggest, wrongly, that the psalm is applicable only to males. The translation one, gender neutral yet singular, captures something of both the unique profile of the man, as well as the general applicability of the pronouncement of blessedness. Our purpose is not to criticize, but to establish criteria for success in capturing what we've concluded are the most relevant elements in the Hebrew text. Once those have been identified, we can evaluate how other translations or works of art are able to capture those elements as well. That is the big picture of our project. Thank you for watching.